Thanks for being here. And raise your hand if this is your first time ever in this bookstore. Amazing. Thanks for joining us, and everybody who's coming back. Thanks for returning. So those of you who are here for the first time, you see, it's worthwhile to come back, and we hope to see you guys soon and often. We are here tonight, of course, to celebrate the new novel, The Chinese Groove by Kathryn Ma. I think we should start by making some noise for Kathryn. Truly a reason to celebrate. I'm thrilled that we all get to be here in the same room and to celebrate this beautiful book, which I loved so much, and I know that you guys are all going to love it. Has anybody read the book already? It's just out today. All right. We got some friends and family in the house. I'm also excited to have Bonnie Tsui here, and I want to thank you, Bonnie, for being here and leading the conversation. Y'all make some noise for Bonnie. My name is Evan Karp. I'm the events manager here at Booksmith. We are a 47-year-old independent bookstore and a mainstay of this neighborhood, the Haight-Ashbury. So without further ado, it is my pleasure and privilege to introduce tonight's stars. Bonnie Tsui is a longtime contributor to the New York Times and the author of American Chinatown, which is winner of the 2010 Asian Pacific American Award for Literature. Her latest book, Why We Swim, was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice and a Time Magazine and NPR Best Book of 2020. It is currently being translated into not 7, not 8, but 9 languages, you guys. It's incredible. I only speak one, debatably. Her first children's book, Sarah and the Big Wave, about the first woman to surf Northern California's Mavericks, was published last year. And her work has been recognized and supported by Harvard University, the National Press Foundation, and the Mesa Refuge. Thank you again for being here, Bonnie, and leading the conversation. And Kathryn Ma, the star of the evening, is the author of the widely praised novel The Year She Left Us, which was named a New York Times Editor's Choice and an NPR Great Read of the Year. Her short story collection, All That Work and Still No Boys, which is one of my favorite titles of all time, won the Iowa Short Fiction Award and was named a San Francisco Chronicle Notable Book and a Los Angeles Times Discoveries Book. She's also a recipient of the David Nathan Meyerson Prize for Fiction and has twice been named a San Francisco Public Library Laureate. I've been so looking forward to tonight since I read this book. Again, I just loved this novel, and I'm so excited to hear you guys talk about it and to hear you read from it, Kathryn. Without further ado, guys, please help me welcome warmly Kathryn Ma and Bonnie Tsui.
Yay! Thank you so much, Evan. We're so excited to be here tonight. Thank you so much, Booksmith, for hosting us. And thank you to all the friends and family and this community of readers and writers that we're so lucky to be a part of, and that we're so lucky tonight to celebrate with you and to celebrate Kathryn and her new wonderful book, The Chinese Groove, which I'm going to jump on the bandwagon, but I will say that I did read this book and loved it so much. And, you know, our community, Kathryn and I have been talking quite a bit about how much our community really means to us. And, you know, it's true that over the last several years, that community has been tested and, you know, that sense of belonging has been shaken repeatedly. But what I really want to focus on tonight is that that to recognize that this is a book that that celebrates the Chinese American community and the strength and joy of it and the long arc of that experience. And it's just so fun, and so it means a lot to be able to do this tonight with you. So let me tell you a little bit about The Chinese Groove. It is a funny, tender, and big-hearted novel, and it's getting tons of praise and attention from everyone, including the New York Times, and I'm sure all of you read the wonderful review that came out today, and it calls the story imbued with inherent optimism, and it also received praise from the San Francisco Chronicle and the Washington Post and starred reviews from Kirkus and Publishers Weekly and as an Amazon editor's pick, and I could go on and on and on. But I wanted to focus on the story. You know, it's the story of a young man from China whose Western nickname is Shelley. And Shelley leaves an unhappy existence in Yunnan province and, like so many before him, comes to San Francisco in search of a better life. And he has big dreams of joining his rich American relatives, finding love, and making lots of money, as do we all. But when he arrives, he finds out that his Uncle Ted and Aunt Aviva want nothing to do with him. They've suffered a profound loss that's still haunting them, and which has just about destroyed Ted's relationship with his father, Henry. And all of Shelley's dreams now seem out of reach. And this book is by turns sad and funny, and is narrated by Shelley in this really winning and irresistible voice. And I know that Kathryn is eager to share that voice with you, and so I'm going to turn it over to her to read from the first pages of the novel.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Since this is our first event, today is the very first official day that the book is out. I want to just pause for a moment and say a heartfelt thank you to my friends and family. Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you for being here, and thank you for marking this complicated moment when we both celebrate and we struggle to understand. But it's very special to me that we're here tonight sharing this moment. Thank you to my family, to my husband, Sanford, to my daughters, Emily, Hannah, and Eliza, to my son-in-law, Zachary. They've been by my side for many years as I worked on and then completed the book, and I'm just so grateful. Special thanks to Evan Karp and Booksmith. Evan, you are a San Francisco literary treasure.
Woo, woo, woo.
You are a treasure. For years, Evan has been bringing readers and writers together, and we really, really appreciate it. I also just want to say a special thanks to the amazing folks at Counterpoint Press, including the team who has brought so much attention to the book in the last few months, Megan Fishman, Rachel Ferschleiser, and her colleagues Yuki and Alicia, and many others. I've had a wonderful experience working with Counterpoint, and I feel very fortunate. So as Bonnie said, I'm going to read just from the first two opening chapters of the book. I typed it out for myself to make it a little easier. You have to imagine me as an 18-year-old young man from Yunnan, China. Chapter 1. The relatives treated me rudely, beating me and calling me names, and so on my 18th birthday, my father buried his head in his hands and cried until the bottle was empty and his tears were spent, and he was at last decided it was time to let me go. Grubs like us didn't get many chances, and he'd promised Mother before she died that he'd send me, their son and only child, away from this unhappy life and into a brighter world. There was an uncle, he said, conveniently rich, living in San Francisco. I should leave our home in Guizhou, Yunnan province, the most beautiful realm in all of China, and move in with Uncle and figure out from there, foot in the door and student visa and green card and a score of other words my father called out in the weeks that followed as I cleaned our shoes and boiled our broth and swept our single room. Words that made no sense to me, but ladled not an ounce of care into my black-haired head. I was all for the plan. Bathed in Mother's dream for me, I'd been waiting for years to depart. I didn't want to be like my friends who were lined up to work at the beautiful Objet d'Art and World Crafts Tin Factory. Theirs wasn't the fate for me. My future lay outside those gates, for where in a factory could I become the man I intended to be, which was a cool guy and a poet? I told my father, yes. The relatives hated me for ancestor reasons, which you might think unfair, but I well understood because I was born into the despised branch of the family. My great-grandfather, a handsome devil, was known to all as the wayward son of his father's third wife, a gambler and an opium addict. The son, not the wife, though who knows? Maybe the third wife ate the flower too. In the photo my father has of her, she's really skinny. My father knew how tough it was to be the bastard son of the bastard son of a bastard. Okay, maybe not that many bastards, and technically untrue. Third wives were all the rage in the ancient days of yore to those with brains and money. But as far as the aunties were concerned, father and I were lodged on the lowest rung of the family ladder, and nothing we could do would lift us from the mud. From where I stood in proud Guizhou, tin capital of China, but lousy with kicking cousins, I couldn't quit soon enough. I'd hold father in a warm embrace and promise to make him proud. Then I'd soar straight to Uncle's house, where my new family was waiting.
Don't you want to know what happens next? I mean, this is what I love, the first pages that just sort of like hook you and intrigue you to keep going, because you want to know what happens. And I thought we'd start our chat by getting a little bit into the backstory of this character, and also just, where did this story come from, and what sparked the book for you?
Yeah, there were many points of origin for this book, but there was one in particular which was very important to me early on, as I first started to conceive of the novel. So in 1999, I was very lucky. I was able to travel with my parents to China to visit my father's hometown. It was the first time he had been back to his hometown in many decades. He had been permitted to go to China after China reopened in the 70s and 80s, but he had not been permitted to go home to his home city, because he grew up in an area of Yunnan province, similar to my hero Shelley. He grew up in an area that was very close to the border of Vietnam, and it was closed to Westerners for far later than other parts of China. So in 1999, we traveled there, and my brother and I and my parents, and you can imagine what a profound experience that was for all of us. Joyful, because my father was able to return home, but really profoundly sad too, because by then his parents and all his siblings had perished. There were a lot of relatives, though, still there. Lots of his nieces and nephews, many of my cousins, many first cousins. I had no idea I had so many first cousins. And at one point during our trip, we were hosted by the family in the courtyard of the old family home. The home was in ruins by then, but the courtyard was still usable, and they were allowed access, and they hosted us for this home-cooked meal. And there was a head table, and my parents, of course, as guests of honor, were seated at the head table, and next to them was an elderly gentleman. And I thought, oh, who is this guy? I was trying to keep track of everybody, but no one would talk to him. He was completely ignored by the rest of the family. They very assiduously, turned away from him, and no one spoke to him. And I thought, well, this is so strange, because he's both within the family, but also disdained by the rest of the family. I buttonholed my father that night in the hotel, and I said, who is that man? And my dad, who was a very gentle soul, replied with uncharacteristic sharpness. He didn't want me to ask that question. And finally he said, he's the black sheep of the family. It made it very clear, I don't want to speak of it. And I was just, that image stayed with me for many years, of someone who was tolerated by the family, but not part of the family, not actually embraced by the family. And I began to think of that as a kind of interesting analogy, perhaps, to someone who has to travel far from home, who goes to a new community, someone who's looking for belonging. So they're tolerated, they're accepted, they're allowed to be part of a larger community, but they're also kind of invisible to the rest of that community. And that was one of the seeds of the story. And then I decided actually to give that character of someone born into the despised branch of the family, to give him a son, and named him Shelley.
Well, and it's so interesting. in the midst of this very filial, society, and where you really rely on all of the connections and the chains and family, that you then have this like little carve out for someone who can stay there, but is that once part of it and not part of, like, tolerated, but not allowed in. And so you've got this really interesting tension, I think, both within that family and then also when that character comes here, right? And seeking this person is seeking something that he had a sense of back home that he wanted, he didn't have it, right?
Yeah, he has this sort of utopian idea of America. There's a legend in Chinese folklore which is called the legend of the peach blossom forest. I didn't know it for many years, and eventually learned of it as I was thinking about this book. And it's that classic Shangri-La myth that there's some sort of utopian land out there where everyone gets along. It's a beautiful place. Everyone is prosperous. Everyone is provided for. And Shelley has this idea of America as a kind of peach blossom forest. And so when he comes, he has all these dreams. He's sure that these rich American relatives are going to embrace him and set him up with a job and housing and a chance to find love. And then he finds out, to his utter disappointment, that they live in a sort of ordinary small house in the outer Sunset District.
Right, you set the Shangri-La in the outer Sunset, and so I think we should talk about that, like how that happened.
Yeah, isn't it great that we're here in the Sunset? I guess we're in the Hague, but sort of close to the outer Sunset here. The outer Sunset District has always loomed large in my imagination. I have a very tender place in my heart for the outer Sunset, and I think it's because it represents something to me. It reminds me of my parents' own story. They came to the United States in the 1940s, just at the end of World War II, and they met in Ohio. They were graduate students at Ohio State University, and they moved to Pennsylvania. And when I was born, I was number 3 of 4 children. The house they were living in at the time was in Levittown, Pennsylvania. They didn't own the home; they rented, but that's the home they brought me to when they brought me home from the hospital to Levittown. And the outer Sunset District is kind of like a Levittown that you would find on the East Coast, right? It was developed by ambitious property developers. They built affordable homes. It was very cheap to build the homes. I mean, come on, let the outer Sunset District, the rest of San Francisco sort of looks down their nose at the Sunset District. They think of it as very barren. The weather
it's too cold,
butt of many jokes.
Blah, blah, blah.
Housing all looks the same. But I think of it as a kind of land of opportunity. And it surely was for many working class families, and now for middle class families. The outer Sunset is a place you could go where you might be able to afford a house. And so it seemed appropriate to me that kind of Shangri-La, the peach blossom land, would actually be this area of San Francisco, which is kind of a forgotten quarter. But it also represents to me another kind of migration. I mean, the book deals with immigration in the way we think of it. When we think of immigration, we think of people leaving one nation and going to another. But in San Francisco, there are migrations of populations around the city, and the outer Sunset was a neighborhood where people who were leaving Chinatown and were able to decided that they wanted to leave Chinatown and settle in another part of the city. Eventually, they were allowed to buy homes in the outer Sunset. Not at first. Not at first. There were restrictive covenants that kept people of color, Jews, others out. But eventually, because federal law changed and state law changed, Chinese families and many other ethnicities and races were allowed to come to the outer Sunset.
My grandmother ended up in the outer Sunset.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Where did she live?
Well, she lived like Iloa, and the thing is, I didn't know. I was living here in San Francisco for 5 years before my dad told me that she was living there. I mean, that's a whole other story, but we won't get
Wow,
to
we
that
gotta
tonight.
hear
But
that story sometime.
but you know, that my parents came through New York and San Francisco's Chinatown, and my both sides of the family, and I love this idea of the migration within a city that signals that you've moved up. You know, you move from a country to another country, and then within that country, you move from Chinatown, was usually the landing point, to other places that signify that you've moved up. And so I do love that the Outer Sunset is celebrated in this way in this book, and then also is still like sort of mysteriously and enigmatic to Shelley, because he gets here and he's like, what? Well, where's the giant, you know, this golden palace that I was promised, and yet he figures it out, you know, he finds his way. And I just find that it's, you know, I think this is a great point to ask about the phrase, the Chinese groove, because I know you've been asked this ad nauseum since the book has been coming up. But, you know, what is the Chinese groove? I think that people would like you to talk about that a little bit.
The Chinese groove is both a kind of hope and a hazard to Shelley. He has talked himself into believing that there is a kind of safety net for him when he's making this big journey, that he's going to find other people who have come from China. He calls them his countrymen, who are going to lend him a helping hand. And he thinks of it as a sort of unspoken bond between countrymen that transcends international borders, that is deeply rooted in cultural and ancestral roots. And so it gives him a sense of confidence. It gives him a sense of, oh, there's going to be a safety net for me. I'm not going to utterly fail because there are people who have come before me who are going to lend a hand. But it's a hazard for him too, because it gets him into all sorts of trouble. Because is it true that people are going to really help him? I mean, these relatives that he's come from, they're not in the least bit rich. And they don't want to have anything to do with this young man whom they don't even know, who's imposing, you know, barging into their lives and imposing himself on them. They tell him, well, okay, you can stay for 2 weeks. And he thinks, I'll be able to talk them into a longer stay. And indeed, they throw him out after 2 weeks. So the Chinese groove is meant somewhat ironically. You know, I offer it in a somewhat satirical manner too, because he doesn't get what he thinks he's going to get from him. But on the other hand, is there some sort of connection? Does he have a bond with people that he meets that's going to see him through? That's one of the questions that the book explores. Well,
I think that the comic voice that you have for him, and the sense, you know, it is a funny book, and so many books that tackle immigration or migration stories don't have this element of humor that I think it's a high wire act, I think, that was surprising to me, and so also it buoyed me. Like, it made me think really hard about this kind of story in a different way. And I think that that's one of the great achievements of this book, is that you take a story that we have all heard and you flip it in this 90, you know, you're now all of your expectations 90 degrees is like you're out walking on the wall, you know, you really are. And I would love to hear about what you know, what influences you. How did you figure that out? Because it seems to me so difficult to do, and you do it with such grace and finesse.
Thank you for saying that. Shelley's voice is very unique, and it came to me pretty early. I was blessed. I was given this gift of this voice. I mean, the beginning of the book changed quite a bit, actually. The chapters that I read to you, those came much later in the drafting process. But the voice, the tone of the voice, and the way Shelley plays with language, that came to me early. And he was just cracking me up from the beginning. He was just funny. I actually had to kind of rein him in because sometimes he'd kind of get away from me, a wild horse galloping, and I think, no. I want this book to succeed on more than one level.
Right.
I want it to be entertaining. I want it to be funny, but I want it to be sad. I've been in a book club we're in our 40th year right now, my book club. We have read hundreds of books in common, which is pretty phenomenal. And one of the members of my book club always likes to remind us the best novels are sad novels. And I kind of agree with him. I mean, I really do love a book that brings me down to earth and reminds me of the complexity of the human experience. And I wanted this book to be funny, to be buoyant, but to have a sort of river of sadness running under people's feet, under the feet of the characters throughout the book. So that was the high wire act for me, not so much the humor, but how you both, how do you allow yourself the tonal range to both be joyful because he's young and ambitious and naive, so naive, and full of joy, but also he and his father are grieving the loss of his mother, and the people that he comes to live with, his American relatives, have suffered a terrible loss, and they are also sort of stuck in grief. But humor is a funny thing. Humor is very tricky, and it's so individualistic, and I still have like this little needle in my heart from one editor who rejected the book and said, I wish my agent had not forwarded his email to her, which said, it just isn't funny enough. And I hope he's reading now.
Watching now.
Some people find it funny. I mean, it's very subjective, right?
Yeah.
It's very personal, what's funny and what's not funny. I don't know where that sense of irony comes from in me. I have a very different sense of humor than my parents had. My parents, especially my mom, she had a very earthy sense of humor. In her later years, I really always...
I feel like
she was in
earthy means
health.
Something... Yeah, say more.
Well, yeah, I think it makes sense to me that she had a much more... sort of earthy, like body humor, and people pratfalls, people falling on their faces. That would make my mother really let out a belly laugh. And I kind of makes sense to me. I mean, she's a child of deprivation, of war.
Yeah.
My parents grew up lived through the Japanese invasion, through World War II, through Civil War. I mean, these were dire times. You guys know from my last book that I joke, all I survived was disco. My parents really had a rough time of it, and their sense of humor seemed much more, I don't know, less rarefied, I guess. Just, they appreciated irony, but it was more the big, surprising belly laugh. And maybe it was also raising all those kids that my mother did. My sense of humor, I think, comes in part from the kind of reading I did my whole life. I mean, those great British women novelists. Was anybody more brilliant at irony than Jane Austen? And Iris Murdoch, Muriel Spark. I love the witty intelligence of Shirley Hazard. So I think at some level I absorbed some of that view of the world.
I now that you say it, I do think that there's a sort of like situational social decorum observations that you're making, obviously totally different place and time, but in a sort of comedy of manners, that Shelley is experiencing in his new life with his new relatives who don't really want him around, but also are like kind of not saying it until they say it, kind of thing. So actually that makes a lot of sense to me, and I love that. I like to see that through line. I think that this is a good time to hear more of Shelley's voice. I know you prepared another excerpt because I think we would love to hear that.
Okay. I'm just going to read a couple of minutes from a little bit later of Shelley's arrival day in San Francisco. So his He's come to stay with these relatives. They have agreed to put him up for a short period of time. His uncle is named Ted, and his uncle's wife, Shelley's aunt, is named Aviva. And he's eavesdropping on them from the backyard of their home. 2 weeks, I heard Ted say. That's what I told his father. 2 weeks? 2? I thought we decided 1. Aviva's protest set my worry fish darting. What would I do if they sent me away? I was the eggs. They were my basket. 2, Ted said. He'll need time to find a place to live. Good luck with that, Aviva said. There's nothing left to rent unless he wants to move to Bakersfield or Barstow. Does he have any money, do you think? What will he live on? He must have brought funds to get himself started. He's not allowed to work on a student visa. Startup funds. What an excellent idea. I had planned for the Bank of Uncle to make an initial investment, but the chances of that happening seem to be thinning a bit on the ground. I can barely understand what he's saying, Aviva said. Do you think he understands us? Their voices had grown faint, so I belly crawled out of the castle, oozed over to the house, and flattened myself against the deck. Your father, Aviva was saying. I don't want to talk about it, Ted replied. You never do. You never want to talk about anything important. You can't leave me to deal with him alone. You haven't spoken to him in months. His fault, not mine, Ted said. Please, for once, can we leave blame out of it? I couldn't hear Ted's answer. They were moving about the room. Old, Aviva said. Immortal, Ted said. Help, Aviva said. Attention. Their voices faded. I tucked away what I'd overheard, storing it for later. Sometimes information was as valuable as gold. I hustled down the side path around to the front of the house. I'm home, I called as I rang the bell at the orange door. I had 2 whole weeks to change their minds. Plenty of time for persuasion.
See, that's what I'm talking about. You gotta love that optimism. And I feel like when I first read this book, it was something that I absorbed. I really needed that. I think that that's a delightful thing. You know, to get that from a novel. I mean, to get that from a novel and to kind of take it with you into life. So I think this book really does that. At the same time, it really recognizes the landscape that we live in, you know. I think this is a great time to take some questions from the audience. I know, you know, it's a full house. I know all of you want to ask Kathryn so many questions, and I think Evan's going to take this mic around for anyone who has them.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, if you have a question, raise your hand and I'll come on over to you.
Sarah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see you back there, Sarah.
Thanks, Evan. Thank you both so much. This is a fantastic conversation. And Kathryn, congratulations.
Thank you.
Kathryn, amongst your many talents, you're also extremely insightful and you write brilliant reviews of other people's works. I haven't read any of the reviews yet of your book because I want to read the book first. But I'm curious as to, I'm assuming you've read some of these reviews. What has surprised you and or delighted you about reviews that have come out thus far?
I have read the reviews. I read them the instant they are sent to me. Sanford can tell you, I sometimes read them before I even get out of bed in the morning. I think I've been surprised and delighted that people are commenting on the satirical parts of the novel. I think of Shelley as such an earnest young man, but people seem to. Some of the reviews have commented on that kind of ironic distance that is available in the novel, and I love that they see that. There is a kind of slippage between the Shelley who's speaking to us very directly, very much in the moment, and a bit of ironic distance that he brings. He is a retrospective narrator. He's actually telling us this story some years after the events have taken place. But I did not hit that too hard. I didn't want this to be a book of an older man looking back on his life and measuring everything and commenting on the folly of the younger man. That didn't interest me so much because I really wanted to keep that vital energy of the 18 and 19-year-old. But it's been interesting in the reviews to see that people cotton to that satirical distance, and I'll take it. I love it. One of my models in early thinking about the book was Voltaire and Candide, and I am not the all-out, flat-out satirist that Voltaire was in writing Candide, but that notion of the naif, the image of the young man who life brutes about, that was there, and so I think there is a little element of satire in the book.
Hello. So Kathryn, I want to talk to you about being kind of a late in life bloomer. I think that we have this idea in our culture and in our writing communities that you sort of like work, and you get, some things published, and then sometime around like 40, 45, you peak. And then after that, like publishers and agents stop returning your emails. I mean, maybe that's just me, but you kind of have the George Eliot version of things, and I'm just wondering how it is. Was it something internal in you that shifted at a certain point where you're like, all of a sudden I'm going to write these great novels, or did you work at it since you were 20 and you were like on your high school newspaper and all of those things? What was that trajectory like, and did it have anything to do with, I don't know, having kids? Thank you.
I was interviewed a couple of months ago for an article that came out in Publishers Weekly, and after the interview, the interviewer emailed me and she said, "Oh, I forgot to ask, how old are you?" And I answered it, and then that night at dinner I said to Sanford, "Oh my God, I told her how old I am. I told her I'm 66. So old." And Sanford looked at me across from the Brussels sprouts and said, "Did you think that anybody was going to think you were in your 50s? And he's right, like, own it. I mean, I just got a very late start, and then to my dismay, I found out it's really hard to become a writer. It takes a really long time to learn how to write. So I got the late start. I had a whole nother career before I started writing. I started writing when I was 39, and I thought, how hard can this be? And it turns out it's very hard. I kind of comfort myself. I think, well, it took me 10 years to bring out my first book, a book of stories. And I think, well, it took me 10 years to become a decent lawyer. I mean, it took me 10 years to be worth what they paid me as a lawyer. And so why shouldn't it take me 10 years to write 10 stories? I mean, it is hard. And so I think I do feel like a late bloomer, but I didn't have the courage to become a writer when I was younger. There are times when I regret that. I do have remorse about that, but that just wasn't in the cards for me. I had parents who saw their bringing up of kids a certain way. I didn't have to. There was a lot of Chinese groove around that. They didn't have to say a word to me, and I understood what the expectations were. So I had the more traditional career. But there was always something in me that wanted to see, can I do it? Can I do it? Do I have it in me? Do I have the imagination for it? I couldn't imagine a life for myself as a writer until I was old enough to, I think, cut the apron strings. It took me a long time to do that. and I'm so happy I did. I'm so happy I did, and I've been lucky enough to be healthy enough to, I've lived long enough that I was able to have that long apprenticeship, but it's taken a long time.
We're happy you did too.
And I'm desperate to get to work on the next novel because the sand is running out. Chris.
Thanks, Kathryn. Well, following up on that, I'm curious what parts of writing are hard for you personally, and which parts are less so. Which parts are your funnest parts?
Yeah, the hardest part is the first draft. I was listening to a podcast this week, and someone said they were at a residency and they had a goal of 2,000 words a day, and I practically dropped my oatmeal down the front of my shirt. 2,000 words, I can't imagine. When I'm just writing chapter 1, we won't even talk about the beginning of a book because it gets changed so much, in downline drafts. But let's just say I just build it scene by scene. And when I sit down to write a scene, if maybe I have 4 good hours in me a day, and maybe I'll get 200 words on the page, maybe. What's easier is the revision. I mean, writing is really all about revision. I feel that writing is all the good stuff takes place with revision. That's where you really shape, and you have to be ruthless with yourself. A dear friend of mine was telling me that as part of Lunar New Year cleanup, she was throwing out old drafts of a beautiful novel she's written. I thought, that is a good goal. That is a good goal, throwing out drafts. So I took down some drafts and I was chucking them out, and I thought, wow, I'd forgotten I'd written that whole. You got to throw it out, if it's not serving the book. And I had an excellent editor, and he took the rein. He made the book so much better.
But it's interesting to see where it was. I mean, it's almost like you lay the foundation down, and then you lay the foundation down, and then you put a flooring on it, and then you rip that flooring out and you put down other flooring, but you forgot you put on that middle flooring, but it got you there. It made you you got to make those choices later because that ugly flooring was there first, and you decided you didn't like that.
Well, and the writer I admire was once describing, there are different kinds of writing. There's the writer who just, puts it down on the page and keeps going forward, keeps pressing forward, and doesn't worry about the fact that it's messy and it's a shitty first draft, as Annie Lamott tells us. And then there's the writer who's like the person who polishes every paragraph, even though those paragraphs might not stay. And she said, isn't that ridiculous? You don't wash your kitchen floor one linoleum tile at a time. And I thought, that's true. I'm going to try to wash the whole floor today. I'm not going to go back and perfect those words I wrote yesterday. I couldn't do it. I cannot do it. It is just not my process. I can't do it. I have to shape it and shape it and shape it before I can move on, and some of that stuff just ends up on the cutting room floor.
So in respect to, in respect to that, how you commented, do you know the arc of the story? Well, when you start the book, or, I'm sorry, my phone just happened to be ringing right now. While you're polishing that one tile, do you know where it's going? Where you want to end up?
Yeah, I do have a general idea, a somewhat general idea of, I think it's helpful for me to have a sense of the arc, but much changes along the way. I love writing beginnings. I mean, I love the beginning of a book, and I love writing endings of the book. I think that's a part, actually, Chris, that I think I can do, whether it's a short story or an essay or the end of a novel. I feel like I arrive at the endings pretty easily. It's the middles that are. Do you agree, Bonnie? What do you think? The middle, yeah. Middles are hard. Middles are shapeless. And one of the things I wanted to do with this book was I wanted to have many subplots. I had this vision in my head of Shelley with the poles and the spinning plates and him running around and spinning each plate, and yet I wanted to bring everything down to a close at the same time. He had to bring all the plates down safely. That was just an image I had for the book. Later I realized that long after the book was finished, I was thinking about what are the influences on this book, and I started to think about the fact that I have seen that play, Servant of Two Masters, many times. I don't know if anyone's ever seen it. There's been a wonderful film made of it, and it's a commedia dell'arte play, by Goldoni from hundreds of years ago. And I thought, oh, that's pretty good. My Chinese hero is an Italian commedia dell'arte star. I think that actually influenced the book. I wasn't aware of it at the time because the writer is always the last person to know what she has put on the page.
Everyone's going to tell you, so don't worry.
Sarah's right. Like, the reviewers will explain to me what I have written.
What did you write? What do you say? What do you say?
Another question? Oh, yeah.
Kathryn, thank you so much. I don't know when did Shelley leave China, and did you give that much thought as to when you were going to set the novel?
Tortured thought over when to set the novel, because actually I wanted to bring it as close to present day as I could. But then we had this terrible presidential election, and it changed our conversation about everything, including about Asian America, including about immigration, including about wealth inequality. A big theme in this book is housing and home and affordability of housing, and how fundamental that is to our ability to live the kinds of lives that we deserve to live. And I just did not want to deal with. It was just going to take over the book if I were to set the book in those years that I was writing it, 2016, 2017, 2018. So in the end, I decided to set it in 2015, right before the election. What a shame. But that was an aesthetic choice that I felt I had to make.
Hi, Mom. You talk about the evolution and how much the plot changes, and maybe that you're even last to know, but you also spoke a little bit about how early on the voice of Shelley came to you. And I think one of the things that I really admire in your process is your own conviction in your story and in this story, and also the reason we love Shelley is because he has so much self-conviction, and he's just he just believes in himself so much. Can you talk a little bit about maybe moments where that conviction was challenged for you with Shelley or with the novel, or maybe how you wrote through that?
Yeah, luckily for me, I have written other novels. The novel that I published before The Year She Left Us is the title. That's the third novel that I've written. I wrote 2 novels before then that have not been published. The first novel, I call it my teething novel. I did not get an MFA degree, and I just wanted to, this was my MFA degree. I just wanted to see, can I do it? Can I do it? And I never tried to publish that novel. The second one, I tried to publish, and no one bought it. But by then, it was like, I think of that novel as my Patronus novel. Do you remember in Harry Potter, where Harry, he's trying to do the Patronus spell, but because he's traveled in time travel, because he's traveled in time, he's seen himself produce a Patronus, so he has confidence that he's going to produce a Patronus when he actually does it. And so by the time you get around to, the next long project novel, it takes me years to write a novel. The fact that I'd done it before, even though they never got published, the fact that I'd done it before, and I guess I did have one published when I wrote this one, gave me enough confidence to think, yeah, I'm going to sink 7 years of my life into this little project. Shelley doesn't have choices. He has self-confidence and he has optimism because he has so little choice in the matter. He doesn't have economic opportunity. His family despises him. No one's going to give him a leg up, and so he believes in himself because no one else really believes in him. His father does. His father loves him, but his father is so wounded by the loss of his wife that he doesn't have anything left over for his son, and that's a thread that runs through the book, and part of what I needed to give Shelley that verve, that drive. But of course, life is going to beat him down. I mean, he gets chastened because nobody can stay on the cloud forever, and have any kind of sustainable life. And that's part of his journey.
That's his growth.
That's his growth. Yeah. But there's a lot that goes on in the novel that doesn't necessarily have directly to do with his path, because there are these other characters and there are these other subplots, and there's a whole section of the novel, or not section, there are various themes of the novel that have to do with what is family, how do we reconcile with our family, or how do we create new family? Do we look for an intentional community, or do we try to repair with the family into which we're born? How do you have an individual life and also honor your family and the duties that you have to your family? This is the question, right? This is the great question of my life, having grown up in a Chinese American family where Bonnie said the word filial and the hair on the back of my neck went up at the start. It was like, oh yeah, we should have had a trigger warning at the time.
Filial duty, that would have really gotten you.
Yeah. But we feel it. I mean, that's the Chinese groove, right? We feel it in our bones, that sense of obligation to the family, how one honors the family, but also how one makes a life of their own. And that goes back to Laura's question about, learning how to make a life of my own as a writer, is so different from the earlier path.
Kathryn, since you brought it up, do you find people have trouble understanding the cultural aspects, or do you find that this transcends cultures, that your understanding of how families function is understandable across cultures?
I think that people bring their own expectations and their own experience of life to any book they read. But if the novel is to succeed, if any novel is to succeed, it must do two things. It has to be very specific to the characters in the story, and it has to be universal to the reader. It has to reach the reader somehow through describing human experience and human emotions in a way that we feel in our body as we read the story. So I don't feel like people need to understand the cultural references in a really specific way, as long as they are reading with an open mind, and I welcome their expectations, their assumptions. Shelley, on the other hand, he does make fun of that a little bit in the book. He sometimes Shelley speaks directly to the reader. Not very often, I didn't want to overdo that, but sometimes Shelley speaks directly to the reader and gives us a little sense of, well, I'm not quite the naive fool that you might think I am. Be careful. He warns the reader, be careful, I'm actually very sophisticated. And we're kind of laughing, we're like, you're not that sophisticated. but is he? And at one point he tweaks the reader a little bit, because he's introduced some characters to us, 30 pages earlier, and he's told us their names, and he's told us a little bit about them. But then later, in a scene that takes place at Lunar New Year banquet, so this is appropriate because we're celebrating the Year of the Rabbit now, he says, he stops in the middle of his description of the scene, and he says, oh, by the way, this is a friend of his Uncle Ted. This is his dear friend, Ted's dear friend, Kate. He says, oh, by the way, Kate's Chinese American. And I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you that earlier. And, I'll be curious to see, what do readers think when they said that. Did the reader picture Kate as a Chinese American character? There's many labels in this book, but sometimes the labels come, maybe on a little delayed mechanism, and it's a little playful. But it also, perhaps we'll stub our toe on it a bit and think, oh yeah, what were the biases I brought to this reading, or what cultural expectation am I bringing here? And it's fun, but hopefully it also, raises a little bit of a question in someone's mind, or makes them think a little bit more.
Yeah.
Good then.
Hi, Kathryn.
Hi.
I can't wait to read this book because I grew up, as you know, in a Chinese American family in the middle of Kansas, and we were gifted my cousin, who was a 17-year-old from Zhejiang province, that came to our family. So I'm really looking forward to reading it. I wanted you just to speak to just that process of how are you able to understand a 17-year-old boy's voice? You said Shelley just kind of came to you, but I'm just wondering what's that process like for you?
Yeah, the review that I live in terror of is the review written by the 18-year-old boy. Man, that's going to get me in all sorts of trouble. I just love the novel form so much. I love reading novels. I love thinking about novels, and somehow when you give yourself permission to take on a project as long as writing a novel, I think you just give yourself full permission to do this. For me, I gave myself full permission to go anywhere or try anything. Because it's a project that may end in heartbreak. I know that. I've written 2 novels that took years to write, and those ended in heartbreak. You end up with a broken heart when you can't find readers for your book, and so you've got to just let it fly. I mean, you got to have the faith in yourself, but it's more than that. It's just a kind of a goodness to yourself. It's self-care at the utmost level. Do whatever the hell you want. No one's really waiting for this book except for me. So I'm going to do what I want. And I wanted to write. Part of it was a little bit of a reaction to the writing of the last book. The last book was narrated by a very angry young woman, also a teenager. And I think at an unconscious level, I didn't really realize it until I was well into this book, that I was sort of writing in reaction to having lived so long with that character, and I wanted to do something very different.
Right, because ultimately you are spending years with this person in your head.
You are. And I was telling Bonnie, I just listened to the first part of the audio book, and that's such a strange experience because you hear someone else, narrating the words that I've written, and it sounds like a particular way in my head, and then you hear a professional actor who's much better at reading it than I could ever be, but it does sound very different than how I hear Shelley in my head. And but it'll be. I remember reading an interview with Faye Dunaway, who. No, it wasn't an interview. It was a profile of her, and maybe it was Pauline Kael. I can't remember who it was. Somebody in the New Yorker was writing about Faye Dunaway's portrait of Joan Crawford and said, "Boy, I hope for Faye Dunaway's sake that she can get this lady out of her head, because she's so fully embodied it. And man, I hope for her mental health she's going to be able to exorcise." And Yeah, I feel a little bit like that. Shelley's kind of taken up residence there. And I need to get working on the next project, so
he'll move on.
2 weeks, Shelley. I'm giving you 2 weeks, and then you are out of here. Thank you all so much. Thank you for coming.
Oh, I have another
I'm
question.
sorry.
I think one of the many pleasures of this book is that it's set in a place that so many of us in this room love, San Francisco. And so I'm wondering if there are certain streets or neighborhoods, I mean, obviously the Outer Sunset, but just certain locales that you feel Shelley's presence or some of the other characters, and how you use place to generate some of the images or like pivotal scenes that came out of the book.
Yeah, Hannah's asking about specific places in San Francisco that helped engender the book, and favorite places. I am so grateful to Bonnie for writing this amazing book, American Chinatowns, which I used in my early research of the book. I realized early on, Shelley needs to spend some time in San Francisco Chinatown. And as much as I love visiting Chinatown, it is actually a rather opaque place to me. I don't feel that I know it and understand it, and I'm embarrassed to admit that part of my entree into that community is through a book versus, actually knowing people who live there and spending meaningful time there. But thank you, Bonnie, because it was important to me to read that, and then of course to spend time. And then I spent a lot of time in the Sunset. I did all this. Well, you work on a novel, you do all this research. A lot of it just is. Is it really necessary to find out what the style of homes were that the Dolger Company built in the 1940s? The Trianon, the Lexington, the Junior Fox. But it's so fun. It's so interesting to teach yourself about, and learn a lot of San Francisco history along the way. So yes, the Outer Sunset, I spent a lot of time there. I spent a lot of time at the fly fishing pools in Golden Gate Park, because there's a character who loves fly fishing. I did not have the nerve to actually pick up a fly rod, but I watched a lot and I took videos, and then when I wrote those scenes, I would play the video back on my phone so I could watch the action of the fly fishermen. I spent a lot of time looking at the bison. My niece told me that the bison run when it rains, but that's the only time you ever see the bison move. So Evan's nodding. There's a scene in the book where the bison finally run in the rain. San Francisco, I love our city so much. It's talk about heartbreak. I mean, I feel like right now the city it's letting us down. We're letting it down. We're struggling with our city. I don't want to let it go. The city itself is a character in the book, as real to me as any of the people in the book, and I wanted to honor the city and its history, and also maybe hold it a little bit to account, because we as San Franciscans, we sometimes think of it as a peach blossom land. We're very proud of our progressive politics and our multicultural aspects, and yet we fall so short of those ideals. So all of that, my love for my home, for my hometown, just like Shelley. I had never thought about this, but Shelley is so proud of being from the tin capital.
He's in there.
2 more weeks and then you're out. He's so proud of being from this area of China, and he's not apologetic about the fact that he comes from this very polluted city, that literally is the tin capital of China. That's their main export product. This area of China, they export tobacco and tin, and I have that kind of pride for San Francisco, where I both love it and I also see that there's always work to be done.
Another question? I have time for maybe one or two more if anybody has a burning one. had one, if that's okay. I actually wanted to ask about Shelley's taking up of residence. Sometimes when I read a book, it doesn't happen too often, but it happened here with Shelley. I get a voice or a character that is so strong. I imagine you, having spent a lot more time with Shelley than I have, I imagine that voice is with you for some time, and Shelley has plenty to say, and I'm wondering, do you channel that? Do you just tell Shelley to like shush, or what like how are you dealing with that? And yeah, 2 weeks. I mean, I love this ultimatum, but like, how do you kick Shelley out?
I think I got to get another relative to move in. Yeah. I'm so anxious to get started on another novel. I'm just so anxious to. There's a scene in the book where Shelley has a long conversation with a silkworm, and I keep hoping that silkworm's going to show up, and he's trying to work out a problem, and the silkworm shows up and has a whole long dialogue with him and helps Shelley sort of. The wheels are turning, and Shelley. One of the things you try to do as a writer is when you begin a scene. Your character goes into a scene a certain way, and by the time they emerge from the scene at the end, something is different for them, and that's very evident in the silkworm scene. He goes in with one set of problems, and he comes out. He thinks with a solution, it's a whole other set of problems. But I'm just really hoping that silkworm shows up and helps me work on the next book, because it hadn't come yet. It has not come yet. And then when you get involved in another project and you begin to invent a whole new set of characters, and the setting is going to be very different. I know that it's not going to take place in San Francisco, and then you gradually let go. But it's a kind of. It's like letting go of a child. It's painful, It's painful, especially because I think he's served this book well. He's served this book well. I'm proud of this book, and I do think of him as a sort of being outside myself. That's a little scary, but I do think of him that way.
Yeah, and the good thing is that we can always visit him, by picking up the book.
Yeah.
Which I am so excited for you guys to read this book. For those of you who haven't read it yet, I know you guys are going to enjoy spending time with Shelley, and maybe some of you can take Shelley off of Kathryn's hands. Thank you and congratulations. So happy to launch The Chinese Groove into the world. Y'all, let's hear it for Kathryn Ma.